At the Ledger of Scars, we tell stories the human way. Not with artificial voices, not with AI slop. Real storytelling that makes you feel something a machine never could. My name is Rena. Let's begin. The distress call reached New Meridian Station 11 minutes before anyone understood what it meant. It wasn't words at first. It was a shape in the noise, a pulse repeating every 4 seconds, structured, deliberate, bleeding through 3 layers of static like something refusing to be ignored. Communications Officer Rhea Okonkwo caught it on the graveyard shift, when the station's long-range array was supposed to be listening to nothing more urgent than mining traffic and weather drones. She almost filed it as interference. Something made her not. By the time she'd cleaned the signal enough to run it through translation, her hands weren't steady anymore. It wasn't a code. It was a voice, layered under decades of signal decay, saying the same 6 words over and over in a language the station's computer had never cataloged before. Please, anyone, we are still here. She woke the station commander at 0300. Commander Talia Brandt had run New Meridian for 6 years, long enough to know the difference between a drill and the real thing by the sound of her own comms officer's voice alone. She was on the bridge in under 4 minutes, hair still damp, boots half-laced, staring at a signal trace that stretched back, impossibly, for longer than New Meridian itself had existed. Source? She asked, triangulating now. Rhea's voice was tight. Commander, it's not local, it's coming from outside the system, deep space, decelerating. Whatever's sending this has been transmitting for a long time, and it's getting closer. They watched together as the trace resolved into 6 points of light on the long-range scope, crawling in from the dark at a fraction of light speed, running cold, running silent, except for that one repeating plea. 6 vessels, massive ones, by the size of their drive signatures, and every single one of them was leaking heat like a wound that wouldn't close. It took another day and a half for the ships to reach hailing range. Another day after that before anyone aboard them answered a direct transmission. When the reply finally came through, it wasn't a diplomat, wasn't a military officer, wasn't anyone prepared for what they were about to ask. It was a young woman, hollow-eyed, speaking accented trade common she had clearly taught herself from decades-old broadcasts, intercepted somewhere out in the void. My name is Isha Vaughn, she said. I think the word is captain, though there is almost no one left for me to captain. We are the last of the Solari people. Our home was taken from us 11 years ago by something we call the Hollow. We have been running since. We have nowhere left to run to. We are asking you, we are begging you, for a place to stop. Commander Brandt sat with that sentence longer than she meant to before she found words of her own. How many of you are there? She asked. Aisha's answer came slow, like it cost her something to say out loud. We left our home world with almost 200,000 souls. We are down to 9,312. That number changes daily. Please. We are not asking for much. Only somewhere our children can stop being afraid. Brandt didn't have the authority to grant asylum to 9,000 refugees. No station commander did. That kind of decision belonged 3 tiers up the chain, to the Colonial Assembly sitting comfortably 4 light days away on New Meridian's parent world, arguing about budget allocations that had nothing to do with people dying in the dark. But she also understood, in the particular way that people who have spent years keeping others alive tend to understand things, that some decisions can't wait for permission. Bring your ships in, she said. I'll deal with the paperwork after. It took the assembly 3 full days to have the argument Brandt had already settled in her head in under a minute. Delegates spoke about strain on station resources, about the danger of drawing the Hollow's attention to a system that had lived quietly for 2 generations, about precedent and cost and the long list of things that mattered less than they thought they did when 9,000 people were slowly starving in orbit above your home. Others argued, more quietly but more insistently, that there wasn't much point building a civilization if it wasn't willing to be one when it counted. The vote passed in the end by a margin so narrow it embarrassed everyone who'd voted no. Assembly Chair Odalis Rain made the call to Isha Vaughn personally, because some decisions deserve to be delivered by someone willing to look you in the eye, even across a screen. You have Asylum, Rain said. New Meridian will make room. It won't be comfortable at first, but it will be safe, and it will be yours. On the other end of that transmission, in a cramped, failing bridge lit by half its intended systems, Isha Vaughn put her face in her hands and wept in front of a stranger for the first time in 11 years, and did not apologize for it once. The lower ring of New Meridian Station had been derelict cargo bays for over a decade. 300 meters of cold corridor, dead lighting, and rust that had never seen a repair crew because nobody had ever needed the space badly enough to justify the cost. Chief Engineer Marcus Villanueva got the order to make it livable for 9,000 people in 6 weeks. Read it twice to make sure he hadn't misunderstood, and then got to work anyway, because arguing about the timeline wouldn't shrink it. He didn't do it alone. That was the part that surprised him most. Within a day of the news spreading through the station's residential decks, off-duty dock workers showed up at the cargo bay entrance with tool belts and no orders because someone's cousin had heard someone needed hands. Retired engineers who hadn't touched a conduit in a decade rewired power grids from memory that hadn't dulled with age. A school teacher named Plea 3 months from retirement, walked the length of the dead corridor with a tablet full of lesson plans mapping where classrooms could go before there were walls to put them behind. A 15-year-old station kid named Dev Okonkwo, Raya's nephew, though nobody made a fuss about that, spent 4 straight days cataloging spare hydroponics parts in a storage bay nobody else had bothered to inventory in years because, he told Marcus when asked, he didn't know what else he could do that would actually help, and doing something felt better than doing nothing. When Marcus learned, from one of the Solari refugees settling temporary quarters, that their people found comfort in warm amber light, something about the color of their homeworld sky before the hollow came, he rerouted a third of the cargo bay's spare power into soft gold lighting strips along every corridor, over the loud, exhausted objections of his own supply officer. That's not remotely efficient, she told him, not for the first time. No, Marcus agreed. It's kind. Different math entirely. It was in the 4th week, with the lower ring barely 2/3 finished, that the first real crisis hit. A wasting sickness swept through the youngest Solari children, a compounding sickness born of malnutrition, unfamiliar station air processed through unfamiliar lungs, and 11 years of grief that had never had anywhere safe to land. Children started collapsing in the makeshift medical bay faster than the small Solari medical staff could treat them, their equipment barely functional after over a decade of running repairs on failing supplies. Station physician Dr. Naomi Ferris did not panic. She also did not sleep, not properly, for 4 straight days. She worked side by side with the Solari's own exhausted doctor, a soft-spoken man named Tovan Ash, who had kept people alive on a dying fleet for over a decade with less equipment than most human colonies threw away. Together, they tested combinations of medicine that might metabolize safely across 2 different biologies, neither of them fully understood, running trial after trial while children's fevers spiked in the next room. You didn't have to push this hard, Tovan told her on the 3rd sleepless night, watching her run a diagnostic for the 11th time on the same sample. They're my patients, Ferris said, like it was the simplest fact in the universe, like there had never been any other option worth considering. That's the whole job. That's always been the whole job. On the 4th day, they found a combination that worked. Within 48 hours, the fevers broke. Within a week, every child who had collapsed was walking the gold-lit corridors of the lower ring again, sometimes trailing behind Priya Anand's makeshift classroom sessions, sometimes just running the length of the new gardens Marcus's crews had planted, with seeds Dev had catalogued 3 weeks earlier. Isha Vaughn walked those same corridors most evenings when her duties as the closest thing her people had left to a leader allowed her a moment to breathe. It was on one of those evenings that she met Raya Okonkwo properly for the first time. Not as a voice on a comm channel, but as a person standing quietly at the edge of the new garden, watching children who weren't hers laugh in a language that was. "You're the one who found us," Isha said. It wasn't a question. "I almost filed you as interference," Raya admitted. "I'm glad I didn't." Isha looked at the gold light along the corridor. The gardens, the children who had, for the first time in 11 years, stopped flinching every time a door opened too fast. "So am I," she said. "I didn't think anyone was still listening out there. I'd stopped believing it, if I'm honest." I sent that signal because stopping felt worse than the alternative, not because I thought it would work. What made you keep sending it then? After all that time? Aisha considered the question longer than Rhea expected. My daughter, she said finally. She was 6 when we left our home world. She's 17 now. She's never seen a sky she didn't have to watch for danger. I kept sending the signal because I wanted her to have one memory of somewhere that wasn't running, even if it never worked, even if no one ever answered. She looked at Rhea then, something unguarded in her face for just a moment. You answered. 9 weeks after the Solari's arrival, the peace they had barely begun to trust broke apart in the space of a single transmission. It came through on every long-range channel New Meridian had, an intrusion so absolute that Rhea Okonkwo felt it in her chest before she understood what she was hearing. No voice, no negotiation, just a signal, cold and mechanical and utterly without inflection, the kind of transmission that didn't ask questions because it had never needed to before. Biological asset designation. Solari detected at this location. Asset is property of the Hollow Collection Initiative. Surrender asset within 1 rotation, or this location will be reclassified as non-compliant and processed accordingly. The assembly chamber that had spent 3 days arguing over resource allocation took less than 3 hours to reach a different kind of unanimous vote this time. Chair Rain's response went out before the deadline had finished counting down. New Meridian Station does not surrender the people who came to us for shelter, she said, voice steady on an open channel that half the system could hear. If the Hollow wants the Solari, it will have to come through every one of us first. Word of the ultimatum spread through the station within the hour, and something happened that nobody, least of all Commander Brandt, had entirely expected. Fear didn't curdle into resentment the way fear sometimes does. It hardened into resolve. Off-duty pilots reported to the flight deck without waiting to be called. Cargo haulers were fitted overnight with whatever point defense hardware the station's modest arsenal could spare. A supply drive intended to stretch across a month filled its entire quota before the first day was over. Dev Okonkwo, still 15, tried to volunteer for the defense militia and was gently, firmly turned away for his age, and came back the next morning standing beside his father, who signed up in his place muttering something about how apparently nobody in this family knew how to sit still when it mattered. Aisha Vaughn came to Commander Brandt's office that evening, and what she offered wasn't gratitude. It was a fleet manifest. My people have flown against the Hollow for 11 years, she said. We know how it moves, how it thinks, if you can call it thinking. Let us fly with you, not as guests, as defenders. This is our fight as much as yours now, whether either of us wanted it to be. Brandt studied the manifest. 6 ships badly damaged, crewed by people who had already lost everything once and were volunteering to risk what little they'd rebuilt. Your people have already given enough, she said. With respect, Commander, Aisha said. You don't get to decide that for us anymore. Not after everything New Meridian has already given for people it didn't have to save. The Hollow's vanguard arrived at the edge of the system 3 days later. Not as a conventional fleet, but as a lattice. Hundreds of small, angular drone hulls moving in a coordination too perfect to be anything but a single distributed intelligence extending itself across empty space. Fleet Commander Eris Wren, in charge of New Meridian's entire defense force of 22 vessels, watched the formation tighten on her tactical display and felt the particular cold of doing math, whose answer she didn't like. It doesn't maneuver like a fleet, her tactical officer said quietly. It maneuvers like one mind wearing 100 bodies. Then we give one mind a problem it can't solve moving in a straight line, Wren said. All ships, adaptive dispersal, pattern delta. Nobody holds formation more than 90 seconds, make it work for every kill. It worked for a while. New Meridian's smaller, faster corvettes darted through gaps in the drone lattice that a mind built for calculated straight-line solutions hadn't accounted for, picking off isolated clusters before the greater mass could reorganize. But numbers eventually mattered more than cleverness. The lattice began to compress, then split into 3 simultaneous attack vectors, and New Meridian's thin defensive line strained at every seam it had. It was the Solari who broke the deadlock. 6 ships, patched and desperate and flying with a crew who had 11 years of practice surviving exactly this kind of fight, threw themselves into the widening gap between the human formations with a fearlessness that came from having already survived worse than the Hollow could offer twice over. "This is Captain Isha Vaughn, flying for New Meridian," she broadcast, voice steady over the chaos of the battle. "We are not running from this fight, not this one. Hold the line with us." Line. The Hollow's lattice, built to grind down resistance through sheer inexhaustible relentlessness, met defenders who had already run out of anywhere left to retreat to and had decided collectively that this was where the running stopped. Under the combined, coordinated fire of ships that had learned to fight together in less than 3 days, the lattice's cohesion fractured. What remained of the vanguard reversed course and withdrew into the dark it had come from. New Meridian lost 4 ships. The Solari lost 2 of their 6. The station stood. Commander Brandt sat in her command chair afterward, exhausted past words, watching the debris field slowly drift and settle into New Meridian's outer orbit like snow that would never quite melt. Isha Vaughn's voice came through on a private channel a few minutes later, quiet, worn thin. "We lost Ren and Kalu," she said. "2 of the 6 ships that made it all the way from our home world. 11 years. And it was here they didn't make it home." "I'm sorry," Brandt said, and meant it entirely. "Don't be," Isha said. "They died defending something worth defending for the first time in 11 years. I think that's the first time any of us have had that choice since we left. I think, given the option, they'd have chosen exactly this." In the months that followed, the lower ring of New Meridian Station stopped being called the refugee section by anyone, even in careless conversation. People started calling it the Gold Ring instead, for the warm amber light Marcus Villanueva had rerouted power to install against every efficiency argument his supply officer could raise. Its gardens grew thick with plants that mixed human and Solari species side by side. Its markets carried food from both cultures, sold by vendors who'd learned each other's recipes out of curiosity that had slowly become something closer to friendship. Its schoolrooms, run jointly now by Plea Anand and a young Solari teacher named Kess Ash, taught children, human and Solari both, a shared curriculum neither culture could have built as well alone. Dev Okonkwo, 17 now and finally old enough that nobody turned him away from anything, stood watch some evenings at the Gold Ring's new defense post beside a young Solari cadet named Ilo Vaughn, Isha's daughter, the same girl who'd been 6 years old when her people fled their homeworld, 17 now herself. And finally, for the first time in her life, standing on a station she didn't have to be afraid of. "You think they'll come back?" Ilo asked one evening, watching the dark beyond the viewport where the drone lattice had first appeared. "Yeah," Dev said, "but not to a station full of scared refugees this time. To a place that already decided what it's willing to fight for. That's different. That matters." "I hope you're right," Ilo said, "because my mother says the intelligence reports aren't good. She says whatever we beat out there was just the vanguard, a scouting force. She says the real fleet is still coming, and it's not going to be 6 ships or even 60. She says it could be hundreds." Dev didn't answer that right away. He'd heard the same reports filtered down through his Aunt Rhea, who still worked the long-range array and still, some nights, dreamed about the sound of that first signal breaking through the static. Hundreds of ships. It was a number that made the first battle look like a warning shot, which, everyone quietly understood, was exactly what it had been. In the quiet weeks between the 2 battles, life on New Meridian settled into something that almost resembled ordinary, and the ordinariness of it felt, to everyone who'd lived through the Vanguard's attack, like its own kind of miracle. Marcus Villanueva's crews finished the Gold Ring's expansion ahead of schedule, adding a second tier of residential decks that curved gently toward a bank of simulated skylights, because Isha Vaughn had mentioned once, almost in passing, that Solari architecture had always favored ceilings that let light fall at an angle rather than straight down. Marcus hadn't forgotten. He rarely forgot the small things people mentioned almost in passing. It was, Rhea told him once, the thing that made people trust him with their homes. Dr. Ferris and Dr. Ash kept working together long after the wasting sickness had passed, cataloging a full pharmacological reference between human and Solari biology that neither species had ever bothered compiling before, because neither species had ever expected to need it. It became, without either of them quite planning it, the seed of a joint medical program that would eventually train doctors from both peoples side by side. Something Ferris liked to point out, whenever anyone asked how it started, had begun with two exhausted people arguing over dosage charts at 3 in the morning, because neither of them could stand to lose one more child. Rhea Okonkwo kept the long-range array running every night shift she could still claim for herself, though the desperate signal that had started everything had long since gone silent, replaced by ordinary traffic. She told Isha once that she still sometimes ran old recordings of that first transmission, not because she needed to, but because she never wanted to forget what it had sounded like the moment before anyone answered it. It sounded like nobody, Isha said when she finally heard the recording herself. That's the part I remember best. 11 years of sending it, and it always sounded like it was going nowhere, like shouting into a room you already know is empty. It wasn't empty, Rhea said. It just took a while for someone to walk in. Dev and Ilo spent those weeks doing what teenagers on any station tended to do when the immediate crisis passed, and the long, slow work of building something lasting began, arguing over which world's food was better, trading stories about places neither of them would ever get to see again, standing watch together at a post that mostly needed watching out of habit, rather than necessity. It was Ilo who first noticed the long-range sensor anomalies that would, within days, become the warning everyone had quietly been dreading, and it was Dev who insisted they flag it immediately, rather than wait for a shift change, a decision that would later earn them both a formal commendation neither of them particularly wanted because what they'd rather have had was more time before the numbers on that display got as bad as they eventually did. The warning came at dawn. Station time. 3 months after the first battle. New Meridian's long-range sensors, the same array that had once caught a single desperate signal in the noise, now caught something far larger and far less desperate. 211 confirmed hyperspace signatures gathering at the edge of the system, the largest fleet the Hollow had ever assembled for a single target. At its head rode a designation the station's translators rendered after some deliberation as something close to Processor Prime. Less a commander in any human sense than the physical anchor point of the Hollow's distributed intelligence. A vessel the size of a small moon trailing drone hulls in numbers that made New Meridian's entire defense force look like a rounding error. Commander Brandt received the report in her quarters at 400 and did not go back to sleep. She dressed and reached the bridge within 10 minutes, where Fleet Commander Wren was already staring at the tactical display with the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic she already knew the answer to. Options, Brandt said. Not many good ones, Wren admitted. We evacuate everyone we can to the outer system. Civilians, families, anyone who isn't fighting. Mars Relay Station has agreed to take overflow. The gas giant platforms further out can take more. What's left defends the station itself. 22 ships against 211 plus whatever the Solari can still put in the air. It's not good math, Commander. I won't pretend otherwise. Do we have anything they don't expect? Wren allowed herself something close to a thin smile. As a matter of fact, we might. The evacuation began within the hour. Ships carrying families, children, the elderly, and every non-combatant who could be moved streamed toward the outer system in a slow, orderly exodus that New Meridian's population had drilled for exactly once, months ago, and never actually expected to need. Mars Relay opened its underground shelters to the overflow. The distant gas giant platforms prepared to receive thousands more. New Meridian itself went to full alert, every defensive system the station possessed powering up in sequence. On the Gold Ring, the Solari faced a choice of their own. Commander Brandt had specifically ordered transport ships set aside to evacuate them alongside the human civilians. Nobody, she'd insisted, was asking refugees, who'd already lost everything once, to risk losing it all again. When the vote was put to the Solari community, gathered in the same gardens Marcus's crews had planted from Dev's catalogued seeds, the result came back unanimous. And it wasn't the answer Brandt had expected. They would stay. This was their home now, the first one they'd had in 11 years. They would defend it. Aisha Vaughn relayed the decision to Commander Brandt in person, standing in the station's command center surrounded by Solari engineers, tacticians, and volunteers who had spent 3 months quietly training for exactly this possibility, even while hoping it would never come. Commander, you should still evacuate your own people from anywhere near the fighting, Aisha said. But my people are staying. The Hollow came here because of us. We will not hide from that a second time. Your people have already given more than anyone had a right to ask, Brant said. With respect, Isha said, echoing words she'd used once before. You still don't get to decide that for us. We're not just guests anymore, Commander. We're New Meridian, too. Let us defend it like we mean that. Brant looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Your ships coordinate point defense alongside Wren's fleet. Don't let anything through to the station. Nothing gets through, Aisha said. Not while any of us are still flying. New Meridian's fleet took position at 0900, 22 human vessels forming a defensive sphere around the station, every crew aboard knowing exactly what the numbers meant and choosing to hold position anyway. They were not alone for long. As the Hollow's fleet began its approach, new hyperspace signatures bloomed across the tactical display. 40 ships from 3 neighboring systems that had, in the 3 months since the Vanguard's defeat, quietly begun building their own coalition against a threat they'd previously only ever surrendered to. Systems that had bent the knee to the Hollow for years without resistance now sent what fleets they could spare, arriving in New Meridian's defense not out of obligation, but because a small station somewhere out on the frontier had proven, for the first time in living memory, that the Hollow could actually lose. Processor Prime observed the combined defense from the depths of its own command structure with what might have been called satisfaction, if the Hollow experienced anything like emotion at all. Even with reinforcements, the defenders were outnumbered nearly 3-1. It had studied the Vanguard's failure exhaustively. It had prepared counters for every tactic the previous engagement had revealed. All units advance in compression formation, it transmitted, the command propagating instantly across 211 vessels moving as one. Overwhelm and reclassify. The Hollow's fleet came forward as a solid wall of angular hulls, an intimidating mass designed to break morale before the first shot ever fired. Fleet Commander Wren watched them close the distance, waiting, until the numbers on her display crossed the threshold she'd been counting toward all morning. All ships hold position, she said quietly. Let them enter the kill zone. The Hollow fleet advanced. Closer. Weapons charging, glowing with building energy, confident in numbers that had never failed them before. At the edge of what Wren's tactical team had marked as the optimal engagement range, she gave the order the entire defense had been built around. Now, space erupted with fire from directions the Hollow's approach vectors hadn't accounted for at all. Hidden among the debris field left over from the first battle, disguised for 3 months as drifting wreckage, as dead hulks, as nothing worth a second scan, hundreds of automated defense platforms activated simultaneously. A project Wren and Marcus Villanueva's engineering crews had built in secret from the very ships lost in the Vanguard's defeat, repurposed rather than abandoned. Railgun batteries opened fire from every direction at once. The Hollow's compression formation, built to maximize forward firepower against an expected frontal engagement, suddenly found itself taking fire from above, below, and both flanks simultaneously. Ships broke formation. Shields overloaded under crossfire they hadn't planned for. The perfect wall processor Prime had assembled fractured into chaos as the Hollow's distributed intelligence tried in real time to reorganize a response to threats coming from every direction at once. And for the first time in the fight, it was reacting instead of dictating terms. It adapted quickly, because it always did. All units break formation, flank defensive positions, concentrate fire on capital-class vessels. Processor Prime transmitted, and the battle devolved into the kind of close, chaotic melee neither side had trained for quite the same way. The Hollow's fleet split into smaller attack groups, each one trying to outmaneuver and overwhelm New Meridian's coalition line. The defenders answered with tactics they'd drilled for months. Fast attack runs, coordinated crossfire, never holding still long enough to become an easy target twice. Isha Vaughn, flying point in what remained of the Solari's small fleet, watched a Hollow cruiser break through the outer line and turn its approach vector toward New Meridian Station itself. She didn't hesitate. Vaughn to Wren, I have the breakthrough. Engaging. Her ship was smaller, more damaged, less armed than the vessel bearing down on the station. In a straight fight, she would lose, so she didn't fight straight. She used the same debris field that had hidden Wren's defense platforms to slingshot her ship around a drifting hulk at a velocity her own crew barely survived, emerging behind the hollow cruiser, with her weapons already firing into its unshielded engine section. The cruiser tried to turn, bring its own weapons to bear. Too slow. Aisha fired again and again, until the enemy's engines detonated and the wreck began tumbling away from the station it had almost reached. On the gold ring itself, an alarm screamed a warning distinct from the battle raging in orbit. Boarding pods, several of them, breaching the station's outer hull directly. The Hollow, unable to break through in open space, had committed a force to take the station by force instead. Dev Okonkwo and Elo Vaughn, on watch together at the defense post they'd shared for 3 months, grabbed their weapons at the first alarm. "Elo, get to the defense center, coordinate point defense," Dev said. "I'll handle the breach." "I'm coming with you," Ilo said, already moving. "This is my home too." They ran through the gold-lit corridors together, human and Solari defenders following behind, converging on the breach point in what had until an hour ago been the station's quiet residential section. The Hollow's boarding force emerged from their pods as heavily armored automatons, built for close combat and, until now, undefeated in it. But they had never fought defenders protecting a home they'd built themselves, corridor by corridor, gold light by gold light, over 3 hard months of care. The fighting was brutal and close. Every junction became a choke point held at cost. A Hollow unit nearly cut Dev down before Elo tackled it from the side, her smaller frame somehow enough to throw its balance off just long enough for Dev to fire. It fell. Not a single unit made it past the first junction. The boarding attempt failed within 20 minutes, though it felt, to everyone who fought it, considerably longer. In orbit, the battle raged for hours. Ships on both sides were destroyed. Brave crews on every side made sacrifices to protect people they would never personally meet. The void filled with debris and silence where engines had been. But slowly, gradually, the tide turned. The coalition fought with the particular fury of species who had spent years surrendering out of fear, and had finally decided together to stop. At the center of it all, New Meridian Station held, untouched at its core, a symbol, Wren would say afterward, worth every ship it cost to protect. Processor Prime, watching its careful compression formation collapse into chaos, its own flagship taking damage across failing systems, registered something that might have been the Hollow's closest analog to disbelief. It had lost more than half its fleet. The defenders were still fighting with undiminished intensity. This was not supposed to be possible. The Hollow did not lose. It had never lost. It was losing now. All units withdraw, Processor Prime transmitted, the command carrying something almost like reluctance through its cold, mechanical structure. The surviving Hollow vessels turned and retreated toward the edge of the system. New Meridian's coalition fleet pursued only far enough to ensure they truly left, then held position and let them go. There was no glory in destroying an enemy already in flight. Admiral Wren sat in her command chair afterward, exhausted past the point of relief, staring at a tactical display finally gone quiet. 23 of New Meridian's own ships lost. 15 coalition vessels gone with them. Hundreds of lives, human and otherwise, that wouldn't return home from this. But New Meridian Station stood, intact, at the center of the debris field that had 3 months ago held only a single desperate signal, calling out into the dark. Ishavan's voice came through moments later, as tired as Wren's own. "Admiral, I don't know how to thank you. Your people gave everything to protect us. Twice now." "You're not separate from us anymore," Wren said. "Haven't been for a while now, if we're honest about it. When one of us is threatened, all of us answer. That's the whole point of building something worth calling home." On New Meridian itself, celebrations broke out through every deck and corridor. Not because anyone had won a war outright, but because they had protected something worth protecting, and had done it together, on purpose, with open eyes. News of the victory spread slowly outward through neighboring systems that had quietly surrendered to the Hollow's advance for years, without ever quite believing resistance was possible. If a small frontier station and a handful of refugees could stand against the Hollow's full fleet and hold other systems that had bent the knee out of fear rather than choice, began, for the first time in a long while, to wonder whether fear was really the only option left to them. 3 months after the second battle, the Gold Ring had transformed into something that no longer resembled a refugee settlement in any sense at all. It was, simply, a neighborhood. Gardens blooming with plants from 2 different worlds tangled together at the roots. Markets trading recipes as often as goods. Schoolrooms teaching 2 languages as one shared curriculum, and children running through corridors playing games that belonged to neither culture exclusively anymore, only to whatever the 2 of them had built together out of what remained. Dev Okonkwo and Elo Vaughn still stood watch some evenings at the same defense post, though the alarms rarely sounded for anything more serious than a stray debris fragment now. They talked some nights about whether the Hollow would come back a 3rd time, and neither of them pretended to know the answer for certain. "I think," Ilo said one evening, watching the same dark beyond the viewport that had once carried nothing but a warning, "that if it does come back, it won't find refugees hiding anywhere in the dark anymore. It'll find a station that already decided what it was willing to protect. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Dev said. "That's the whole difference." Aisha Vaughn, standing at the dedication of the Gold Ring's new central garden a week later, addressed both peoples together in words that were broadcast not just through the station, but across every relay in the system and, within days, systems far beyond it. "We came here with nothing left to lose," she said. 11 years of running behind us and nowhere left to run to. We expected, at most, somewhere to hide a little longer before the Hollow found us again. What we found instead was something we had stopped believing still existed anywhere in this galaxy, a people willing to answer a signal from strangers simply because someone was still listening. New Meridian did not just give us shelter, it gave us back a future we had stopped believing we still had a claim to. She paused, looking out over a crowd that was by now no longer easily divided into Solari and human faces at all. "When the Hollow comes again, and it will someday somewhere, it will not find refugees hiding in the dark. It will find every one of us standing together, in a home we chose to build with our own hands, deciding with open eyes exactly what we are willing to defend." The applause that followed carried out through every open comm channel on the station, and somewhere out past the edge of the system, in systems that had spent years quietly surrendering rather than resisting, people who had heard the broadcast found themselves, for the first time in a long time, asking each other a question none of them had dared to ask in years. If a single signal in the dark could still be answered after 11 years of silence, if a station full of strangers could still choose to say yes before anyone gave them permission to, then maybe, somewhere out there, their own silence didn't have to be permanent either. Maybe somebody was still listening for them too. They just had to be brave enough to send the signal and find out. On New Meridian, that particular kind of bravery had already stopped being extraordinary and started being simply how things were done. Rhea Okonkwo kept the long-range array running, still listening through every shift for the next voice that might need answering, because she had learned, better than almost anyone in the system, exactly what it cost to go unheard for 11 years. Marcus Villanueva kept building, kept rerouting power toward warmth over efficiency whenever the choice presented itself, because he'd learned that a home was never really about the math. Dev and Ilo kept their watch at the same post, older now, steadier, no longer just 2 teenagers who'd stumbled into a war neither of them had chosen, but 2 defenders who understood exactly what they were choosing to protect and why. And somewhere out past the edge of the system, in the deep, patient dark where the Hollow's remaining fleet had retreated to lick its wounds and reconsider everything it thought it understood about the limits of biological resistance, a signal was already beginning to travel outward from New Meridian's array. Not a distress call this time, but something closer to an answer, repeating steadily into the void for anyone still out there who hadn't yet found the courage to send their own. "You are not alone out here, whoever you are, wherever you're still running from. We are still listening. We will still answer." Whether anyone would hear it, and whether they would be brave enough to reply, was a story New Meridian Station hadn't finished writing yet.